Right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting scholars from the social sciences and humanities to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, we will be focusing on race and racism in relation to American foreign policy. To enlighten us on this topic, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome one of the foremost authorities in the field, Michael Krenn, who is professor in the Department of History at Appalachian. Hopefully I've got that right, Michael.
You do.
Appalachian State University, where he focuses on U.S. diplomatic history and especially the role of culture and race. In this respect, I want to highlight two excellent books that Professor Krenn has written. The first is Fallout Shelters for the Human Spirit, American Art in the Cold War. For those of you who are interested in cultural diplomacy, I can highly recommend it. His other book, which is directly related to tonight's topic, is The Color of Empire, Race and American Foreign Relations, which is also absolutely first rate. Among his other books, which sadly I regret to say I've not got hold of yet, but which is directly related to tonight's topic and I look forward to reading, it's entitled Black Diplomacy, African Americans and the State Department, 1945 to 1969. In addition to his books, Professor Krenn has published extensively on the topic in numerous academic journals and edited volumes. Now, normally when I introduce a speaker, I like to say a bit more about their academic background, how they got interested in the topic they're speaking on. But tonight, Professor Krenn is going to relieve me of that responsibility, as he'll not only be discussing the ways in which race and racism feature in both the practice and the study of American foreign policy, but he'll also be saying something about the evolution of his own involvement with the topic and how the study of the topic has evolved over the course of his career. Before I turn it over to Professor Krenn, I'd just like to mention to our participants that if you have any questions, you'll need to enter them into the chat box. To find it, you just need to go down to the lower right-hand side of the screen where you'll see a purple icon. If you click on that, it'll open up, and then you simply need to click the icon on the lower left-hand side. You can enter any questions you have into that box, and I would ask if you do have any questions to also please identify your name and any affiliation. So. Professor Krenn, welcome to the seminar series, and I very much look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to be with you here this afternoon here, the evening there, and giving me the opportunity to talk about my experience with race and U.S. foreign policy. But dear me, imagine that. Ends speaking French. This was the response of Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan after being briefed on the history and culture of Haiti in 1915. And I came across this stunning statement nearly 40 years ago as I worked on my MA thesis on the U.S. intervention in Haiti, and my discovery led me to two conclusions. First, that my initial suspicions about the intellectual prowess of Bryan were absolutely correct. Second, that the issue of race, which had heretofore not entered into my field of vision concerning U.S. diplomacy, might be an interesting thread in the story. Now, today I propose to show you how 4 decades of intellectual wanderings and musings and more than a few missteps since that time convinced me that race was much more than simply a disturbing sidelight of American foreign policy. It was, and it always has been, at the center of U.S. diplomacy. Discovering racist statements concerning the Haitian people from U.S. officials and the American media from that time was, of course, hardly surprising. After all, the Progressive Era, despite its encouraging title, was hardly progressive for African Americans who suffered through some of the most vicious and violent racism since Reconstruction. At the time, however, I was unsure of how to fit this into my relatively traditional description of the U.S. occupation of Haiti. There were so many other, and so it seemed, more important issues to consider. America's economic state, strategic concerns, the fears of German and French involvement in America's backyard. Yes, American officials were racist, but was this a key element in the unfolding events of 1915? In the end, I confined the evidence of bigotry and ignorance to the margins of my story. Perhaps it led American policymakers to decide more quickly that the Haitians were incapable of self-government. Perhaps it even encouraged a more aggressive military campaign against people who were seen as something less than equal. But farther than that, I was unwilling to venture, and so race remained an interesting, if somewhat hazy, figure in the background of my thesis. This was also not surprising. In the extremely Ronchian world of U.S. diplomatic history, such esoteric matters as racism hardly figured at all. When Albert Weinberg argued in his 1935 book on Manifest Destiny that, at least in part, the racist outlooks of American settlers and government officials helped to fuel the nation's continental and overseas expansion during the 19th century, reviewers virtually ignored Weinberg's discussion of race. Only the giant of U.S. diplomatic history, Samuel Flagg Bemis, mentioned the topic, but asked his readers to imagine if the United States, quote, had not taken advantage of the manifest opportunity for expansion across a vacant continent. Bemis thus brushed aside any relevance for racism. After all, how could racism serve as a motivating factor in taking over a vacant continent? He also made clear his annoyance with Weinberg's foray into other fields of study. Quote, the weaknesses result from a distressing sociological and philosophical technical patter, unquote. Best to leave race to those woolly-minded social scientists. However, once I was in my PhD program at Rutgers with my general interest in U.S. diplomatic history, now focused on U.S. relations with Latin America, it soon became obvious that I could not follow the warnings of Bemis. My dissertation, which became my first book, examined the U.S. reaction to economic nationalism in Latin America in the years during and after World War I. My next book continued the story, focusing on U.S. relations with Central America in the decade after World War II, as the Goliath of the North sought to construct a framework of economic interdependence in the early years of the Cold War. And again, race reared its ugly head. Whether it was in the form of malignant paternalism that viewed the people of Latin America as unruly and simple-minded children who needed the guidance and protection of the United States, or more vicious manifestations in which Latin Americans were characterized as savage animals, treacherous mixed breeds, or lazy and mentally deficient drags on civilization, the venom spewed forth in a steady stream from U.S. officials and the nation's media. As I considered this evidence, I was struck by the consistency of the language, the ways in which these racist views were expressed. Whether it was Bryan's amazement at the fact that black people could actually speak French, or U.S. officials in the 1920s bemoaning the fact that there was, quote, very little white blood among Mexican statesmen, which explained why they were so ignorant and of such a low mental capacity that they were utterly unfitted for self-government, unquote. Or six-time U.S. Ambassador Ellis Briggs explaining why economic aid to Latin America in the wake of World War II simply didn't work as well as aid to other, whiter nations, because the people in those other nations were, quote, not tribal, not just out of the palm trees. And our experience has been that the closer to the palm tree the object of American aid is, the less likely it is to utilize American assistance to his or our advantage, unquote. The gist of these comments always remained the same. These were decidedly different, i.e. non-white people, and that made a world of difference. However, I still struggled with the question of exactly what difference this made to the world of U.S. diplomatic history. Although race began to play more and more of a role in the contents of my studies, it remained in a peripheral, or better yet, supporting role. The United States developed clear plans and goals concerning its economic, political, and strategic needs. And, as it turned out, the racist viewpoints of its policymakers just happened to be useful ideological supports for those plans and goals. The United States needed to provide economic guidance because the people of Latin America were racially disposed to laziness that retarded their pathway to progress. The United States needed to provide political leadership because the Latin Americans were racially incapable and lacked the intelligence to lead themselves. The United States needed to protect the racially inferior inhabitants of Latin America, just as one needed to protect helpless children. Interesting? Perhaps. Disturbing? Yes. But meaningful as a means of better understanding U.S. diplomatic history? Uncertain. For the question was raised by many scholars, what difference would it have made had those racist viewpoints not existed? Indeed, that was one of the points Bemis hinted at. Racism or no racism, the United States would have gone to war with Mexico. It would have pursued an overseas empire in the late 1800s. It would have occupied Haiti and intervened dozens of times in Latin America. And if that were truly the case, then race should remain on the periphery, acknowledged but marginalized. Those early studies, however, pushed me, sometimes inadvertently, to look at race in different and significant ways. First, although the language of race remained consistent, the terms in which it was translated to the American public and the wider international audience underwent an important transformation. During the years of World War I and the decade that followed, U.S. officials were not shy about sharing their racial views in public statements, media interviews, and official documents. Derogatory stereotypes of people of color were standard fare in newspapers, magazines, scholarly studies, textbooks, cartoons, literature, art, and movies. After World War II, however, things changed. The impact of the horrors of Nazi racism, the more aggressive voices in the American Civil Rights Movement, and the uprisings by people of color against their colonial masters around the world were notable. While privately, the old language of white racism continued to fill official meetings and classified documents, publicly, U.S. officials changed their tune. Gone were the overt references to racial inferiority, replaced by the new and more sophisticated language of modernization. The reasons for the underdevelopment of regions like Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America was not to be found in the blood or genes. Now the most important factors were culture, history, and social norms. And of course, the United States stood ready, with its economic, political, and military strength to help the people of those areas overcome these obstacles to progress and civilization. Now, this might have been kinder and gentler racism, but racism it undoubtedly was. As geographer James Blount argues, modernization theory was simply cultural racism, which explained that, quote, the superiority of Europeans as individuals of European culture has very, very old roots, and by inference is natural and fundamental. Now, this proposition accomplished everything that biological racism accomplished and more. Now, this was interesting to me on two counts. Now, for one thing, it demonstrated the amazing continuity of racist thinking among U.S. officials. Whatever language they might couch it in, racism remained an important concept even during a time period in which, at least theoretically, the very ideas of race and racism were under assault. But this raised a more important question. Why? The few studies that mentioned race as part of U.S. foreign policy tended to suggest that the horrific racist images spewing forth from American diplomats was largely an effort to curry support among an American public that might not understand the more technical aspects of their nation's economic, political, and military goals. Race, therefore, was a way to whip up the masses. Whether to go to war with Mexico and Spain in the 19th century or occupying the Black Republic of Haiti in the early 20th. Besides, such racism was widespread during these earlier and less advanced periods, and so it was little surprise that U.S. diplomats fell back on pre-existing stereotypes as added ammunition in their efforts to guide the nation's foreign policy. But that didn't hold water in the years after World War II. Of course, racism still existed, but it seemed now to be on the defensive, under attack by scientists and social scientists, decried by the nation's increasingly vocal African American population, and serving as a main point of assault by the colonized masses of the world seeking their freedom. In such an atmosphere, I ask myself, wouldn't racism begin to recede from the White House and the Department of State? Wouldn't it in fact be counterproductive to continue using the old racist tropes? But it didn't recede. It merely reorganized, it developed new tropes, and went right back to work. A rather serendipitous finding during my research now pushed me to approach this issue of race and foreign policy from a decidedly different direction. I came across a 1949 State Department memo entitled, "Countries to which an outstanding Negro might appropriately be sent as ambassador." It laid out in no uncertain terms that there were an extremely small number of appropriate countries and an even smaller number of outstanding Negroes. The memo could identify only Ralph Bunche. This memo started a 5-year journey that resulted in my 1999 book, Black Diplomacy, African Americans, and the State Department, 1945 to 1969. It was not simply the interest spurred by that fascinating memo, however. Despite my earlier experiences with race and U.S. diplomacy and the decidedly negative tone of that 1949 memo, I entered into this next project with some small degree of hope. After all, these were not simply the years of the early Cold War. They were also the years of the greatest civil rights achievements in American history. Therefore, I rather prematurely concluded my study would end with a greater African American voice and participation in U.S. foreign policy, which would suggest the gradual erosion of the pernicious effects of race and racism on the nation's diplomacy. As it happened so often in the past, however, those assumptions about the vitality of race and racism in U.S. diplomacy proved to be absolutely wrong. What my research revealed was that the U.S. Department of State, and later the United States Information Agency, had absolutely no interest in a diversity of voices defining Americans' diplomacy, or a diversity of individuals inhabiting the foreign policy bureaucracy. Moreover, they had no interest in dealing with the issue of race at all, if it could possibly avoid it. When America's race problem became a staple of Soviet propaganda and a concern among U.S. allies, these were dismissed with vague pronouncements about communist lies and the slow but steady progress toward equality for African Americans. When ignoring the problem would no longer suffice in the face of stories of racist violence and massive disenfranchisement, U.S. diplomats merely adopted the tried and true method of tokenism, sending out outstanding Negroes around the world as symbols of American freedom, including the singer Marian Anderson, jazz artists, the Harlem Globetrotters, and touring companies of Porgy and Bess. African Americans who refused to play the part, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and the expatriate Josephine Baker, quickly found themselves under FBI scrutiny, their passports revoked, and their stories erased from the progress trumpeted in USIA films and pamphlets. Inside the Department of State, things were, if anything, worse. I quickly discovered that the tiny handful of African American diplomats who broke into the Lily White Club in the first half of the 20th century found themselves confined to what was referred to as the Negro Circuit, sent from Liberia to Madagascar, to the Canary Islands, to the Azores, and then back to Liberia until they retired or resigned in frustration. Efforts after World War II, as that 1949 memo indicates, were only marginally successful. Yes, an African American was finally named as a U.S. ambassador to Liberia in 1949, and the Negro Circuit gave way just a bit. But even after all of the complaints from civil rights groups, the angry editorials in African American newspapers, and the civil rights successes of 1964 and 1965, by the 1990s, when I began my research, African Americans made up barely 4% of U.S. ambassadors, and nearly 80% of those appointments went to posts in Africa or Caribbean nations with majority black populations. The Lily White Club and the Negro Circuit lived on. Now, perhaps my most stunning find during those years of research was about a little-known episode from the 1958 World's Fair. As the first post-World War II fair coming in the midst of the Cold War, the exhibit was already fraught with political overtones. For the United States, however, the fair came at an inopportune time. The ugly racial incidents at Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, when African American children tried to enter a previously all-white high school, were fresh and raw in the world's memory. How could the U.S. hope to respond? It did so with a highly unusual exhibit entitled Unfinished Business. Now, part of this exhibit was designed to deal forthrightly, at least for 1958, with America's race problem. The first room had newspaper stories plastered across the walls depicting the horrific racial violence that plagued America. The second room tried to take a more hopeful view, posting statistics on rising educational and economic levels among African Americans. And the third room had a large and hopeful portrait of white and black children playing Ring Around the Rosie. The people who saw it, mostly Europeans since the fair was held in Brussels, came away favorably disposed toward America and impressed with its willingness to face its race problem head on. Thus, it was a Cold War propaganda success story. Yet few visitors actually got the chance, because racist congressmen back in the United States demanded that it be shut down. And President Dwight Eisenhower, whose ambivalence about civil rights was already well established, quickly complied. It was the power of racism that most impressed me about this story. Even when it was beneficial to confront America's race problem, even when by doing so the United States scored an impressive propaganda victory over the Soviets, who had feasted on America's treatment of its African American citizens for years, even with all of this, race trumped diplomacy. Or perhaps I had been missing the point all these years, that race was American diplomacy. And that spurred my attempt to finally come to terms with race and U.S. diplomatic history, which came in the form of my book, The Color of Empire, Race and American Foreign Relations, in 2006. The basic premise of the book was relatively simple. I would look at America's diplomatic relations with people of color around the world, from its dealing with Native Americans and Latin Americans in the Western Hemisphere, to Asia, to Africa, and the Middle East. Instead of sprinkling evidence of the racism of U.S. officials in amongst the usual discussion of treaties, wars, economic programs, etc., I moved race front and center. For example, with the Mexican War, race became not simply a helpful addition to the usual analysis of America's territorial desires, but the primary motivating force behind those territorial desires. The Vietnam War became not merely an unfortunate example of American political, economic, and military hubris during the height of the Cold War, but another example of how race shaped the reasons for the war, and, in particular, the unbelievable brutality with which that conflict was carried out by the United States. In many ways, the book marked the culmination of my years of work on race, but also showed how far I had come during that time. From 40 years before, when I tinkered with the ideas of race and racism, throwing them into my studies like interesting tidbits that might or might not be of any real significance, I had now arrived at a time in my career where race became my starting point in terms of analyzing America's relations with the world. And perhaps just as important for my future work, I discovered another starting point as I began the book with a critical investigation of the origins of those views on race that would do so much to form and guide U.S. diplomacy in the centuries to come. And so, what have I learned that might be of interest to you? First and foremost, one must understand the history of race and racism in America. You must understand its origins as much as one understands its contemporary applications. That history teaches you that theories of race and racism did not spring up full-blown, nor were they merely imports from the colonists' European origins. White Americans studiously built their racial views, using science, religion, politics, and economics to support a conclusion that seemed inevitable to them, that whites were the superior race and all others fell far below on the racial hierarchy. From the very beginnings of the nation, race was a central component of America's view of the world and its place in that world. Second, pressing back in time also helped us to understand that race was behind the foreign policies of the European nations. In short, the United States was a part, albeit quite an important part, of a multinational construction of race as a core concept of national greatness and imperial conquest. As I noted above, this was not a situation whereby white Americans simply appropriated the racial views developed by their European forebears. It was a decidedly two-way street, with Americans and Europeans trading ideas, as well as skulls and skeletons for their ethnographic studies, and shaping their understandings of race to fit with their particular historical and contemporary needs. In fact, by the mid-1800s, the United States had most certainly taken the lead in this regard, a mantle it would not relinquish for the next 200 years. And just in case you were wondering, yes, I am taking my own advice. My next book takes a decidedly different turn by looking at Samuel George Morton, an American physician and scientist from the early 1800s who collected nearly 1,000 human skulls in support of his study of cranial capacity and hence intelligence among the various races. His conclusion that the Caucasians were naturally more intelligent gave scientific credence to the racism that drove American settlers to virtually exterminate the Native Americans and cast into slavery millions of Africans, and found a ready audience among European scientists working to provide the intellectual basis for their own nation's empires. Third, taking this longer historical view leads us to conclude that race was not, as some have argued over the decades, simply a kind of add-on to U.S. diplomacy. It didn't ebb and flow depending on the needs of American foreign relations. It wasn't used as a mere propaganda tool to whip up public support for dubious military and political adventures. It wasn't simply a happy coincidence that the racial views of American statesmen just happened to lend support to the policies they pursued in regard to Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. In exactly the same way that race was central to the construction of the American nation, it was foundational in terms of its meaning for U.S. diplomacy. In short, race did not influence U.S. policy or help us better understand the more important economic, political, and strategic wax and wane because of the hatreds engendered by war or the progressive nature of the American civil rights movement. It was constant. It was always a motivating force. Race did not influence U.S. foreign policy. Race is American foreign policy. Because when all is said and done about our research into race in U.S. diplomatic history, it becomes painfully clear. And to be honest, it should have been clear much, much earlier in the history of this field that race is power. It is the concept that suggested to white Americans centuries ago that the color of their skin was not simply a biological curiosity or a vivid example of the truth of the Holy Scriptures. Race denoted power and dominion, the power to annihilate Native American tribes, to cast shackles and chains on Africans, the power to crush Mexico and gain half a continent, the power to occupy foreign lands and brutalize the native peoples to gain markets and resources, the power to pound the Vietnamese into dust for their audacity to challenge the natural order of things. The question, therefore, is not whether the United States would have gone ahead and done these things, even if racism were not a factor. Race was always the primary factor. And so the question should be, if racism had not existed, on what would U.S. policymakers have based their pretensions for world power? The balance of military power rises and falls. Economic power seems even more fleeting. The political rhetoric of democracy and freedom has had a rather hollow ring to it over the past few years. Race, unchanging yet adaptable, supported by science, supported by religion, has provided the one constant in the centuries-long American drive for power. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today.
Michael, thank you so much for your presentation, which was absolutely fascinating. Thinking back on some of these issues in terms of how, in some senses, you have this shift from sort of the overt to the less overt. I was sort of reminded something that I read, I think it was in Robert Metalis's book, where he talks about how the Journal of Foreign Affairs, which we sort of all know very well, used to be called the Journal of Race Development. I think that was a subtle before it sort of took on a different name. So we have a question from Tanya, who asks if you could address Obama's foreign policy. Sort of, how do you understand Obama's foreign policy?
Well, in terms specifically of the issue of race, and that's what we're talking about today. I think a lot of us remember when Obama was first elected, there was all of this hoopla that finally the age of racism was now dead. We were entering into a post-racial world. I remember that in so many of the headlines, some of the articles, and there was the assumption that his foreign policy would express that. And in point of fact, it never really quite got there. In terms of his relations with Africa, with Latin America, with Asia, certainly he expressed a more open sort of persona. He's a very personable sort of guy, but in terms of actually directly addressing so many of the racial aspects of previous U.S. foreign policy, he really sort of stuttered and stopped on that. When he would visit Africa, for example, he would talk about the colonial experience, but as though this was something that was long past, that this was something that Africa now had to move past. And that, I think, reflected his views of the civil rights movement in the United States, that he would often speak about how the old giants of the civil rights movement were now past, and we were past that. We now had to enter a new phase where the old racism, the old racist views, the old barriers, the old obstacles are now gone, and we start to move forward. And I think he was terribly mistaken in that. And I think, too, he appalled a number of his supporters who thought that he would address racism more directly when he pulled the United States from participating in the UN conference on race and racism, which, and I think that was the third or fourth meeting of that particular group. Sort of defended it by saying, well, they're going to be talking about Israel and the Palestinians at this conference, which in point of fact they almost didn't at all. But most people, I think, thought that he avoided that conference because one of the things that was going to come up was the international reparations for slavery. So I think there was a lot of weight put on Obama's shoulders. The idea that suddenly the election of this one individual that obliterated an entire centuries of history and now was going to lead us into the promised land. But I think even at that, his attempts to deal with the international ramifications of race and racism really were halting. And I think by the end of his administration, his time in office had really virtually disappeared from any of his discussions.
If I could sort of follow up on the last question, in the course of your talk, which you focused a lot on the Cold War, for example, and you sort of said in the middle of it, race was American diplomacy. Later on in your talk, towards the end, you said sort of racism still is sort of at the heart of American diplomacy. I'm going to sort of take away two aspects of this phenomenon. One being sort of this issue of the diversity of the Foreign Service on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are this sort of underlying ideology, sort of cultural motif, undertones, and so forth. So as you have more diversity in the Foreign Service, to the extent that that's the case, does it not matter how diverse the Foreign Service is, it's still going to have these sort of racial undertones and sort of ideology and so forth. I mean, that's so ingrained in the system that it doesn't really matter who's running the system or who the president is, that it's going to continue sort of along those lines. I mean, is that sort of a fair statement to make about your views, or do you think that it's different than that?
Unfortunately, no. I don't think it's terribly different. For one thing, I don't think our foreign policy bureaucracy has become terribly diverse. Yes, there are a few high-profile appointments every now and then of African Americans and women, but by and large, the Foreign Service still remains a pale male from Yale. That's what our State Department is in many ways. They've tried a number of programs over the years to recruit more African Americans, to recruit more minorities, and most of those have been fairly abject failures because even though they've recruited perhaps a few more people, once they get into the Department of State, the barriers to actually moving up into positions of power, positions where they can influence policy, are almost non-existent. I sat on the foreign relations promotion boards one year because they have to have outside members for each of the committees. And not a single African American from my particular group was promoted. I also sat through their 2.5-hour program about how diversity is so important, how this is, and sat there in the audience with mostly Foreign Service officers and listened to the grumbling about diversity, about diluting quality, about diluting elitism, about diluting professionalism. That culture is still there. In point of fact, there have been numerous studies over the last couple of years that have shown that the State Department, despite all its promises, despite all its programs, has made very, very little progress in the course of the last 60, 70 years in doing anything substantial in increasing that. And to the other question, I think that the culture of the Department of State, the culture of that foreign policy bureaucracy, because it is so insular, because it's the same people from the same backgrounds, the same constituency, again and again and again. Even though you might have a few more minorities, a few more women coming into the Department of State, by and large, when you look at the positions of power, it's the same people. And those are the same people that have for 200 years shared those general views on race.
Yes, I mean, I was sort of just curious in the sense that, uh, if I remember correctly, the book was called Roots of War by Richard Barnett, who talked about something called the ideological code of the national security managers. And basically, one of his arguments was that unless you shared a certain set of beliefs, that you couldn't rise to the top levels, or at least if you did rise to that level, if you ever challenged that fundamentally, you wouldn't last very long. So I guess in essence, you can get into the Foreign Service, but unless you share a certain set of beliefs or an outlook on the world and sort of America's role within it and so forth, you're probably not going to get very high up.
And that's why retention of so many of those groups, minorities and women, has been such a problem. It's not a great problem to get them to come in and provide programs and scholarships and so forth, but once into that bureaucracy, they realize that it is a very closed little world within the state and particularly the Foreign Service.
We have a question from Oliver who says, thanks, Michael. I'm curious as to your view on Christian Klein's work on American Orientalism that posits that racial attitudes also help to forge cultural bonds between the U.S. and certain regions, particularly Asia.
Yeah, well, of course, the theories of Orientalism, you go back to the old the touchstone, Edward Said's work on Orientalism and how it affected U.S. foreign policy. I think that's an interesting avenue of investigation that we focus so much, and I'm as guilty of it, I think, as anyone else. We focus so much of our attention when we're studying race and U.S. foreign policy on these very, very distinct and very direct pieces of evidence of racism as we understand it. But Orientalism posits that there is, at the same time that that so much of the work we do on race and U.S. foreign policy focuses on the revulsion, the repulsion of these other racial groups, we tend to forget that there is also, with Orientalism, there is a fascination that occurs with these particular racial groups. And over the years, I think we've seen in the forms of Orientalism, we've seen the cultural Orientalism in which, for example, during the late 1800s, you saw this fascination with Middle East culture and Middle East art, and all the Victorian homes had the Persian rugs and all of these kinds of manifestations of that. And I think you also see that somewhat with Asia, that while there are still those racist views that these are inferior cultures in many ways, that these are inferior peoples in many ways, there's a fascination with particular aspects of these cultures that I think is awfully interesting, that draws these Americans and American policymakers in some ways to these areas. But I think in terms of the Orientalist viewpoint, what I think happens most often is from afar, there may be these cultural affinities, this cultural interest, this cultural fascination. But when these groups meet face to face, very often those old racist views, those old racist stereotypes come up awfully quickly. But I think that's going to be one of the next steps in the study of race and U.S. foreign policy. I think myself and a number of others have done a lot of the groundwork. But racism changes. As we've noted in a lot of our studies, it's so adaptable. It adapts to circumstances. It's like a virus. It literally adapts to circumstances. It adapts to needs. It adapts to the climate in which it exists. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think there's some really interesting work coming out on that.
Could I just press you a bit on this question, this issue of adaptation in terms of the post-Cold War period, and specifically in relation to a couple of different aspects. The first one is the sort of post-9/11 war on terror. The second probably being contemporary U.S. views of China.
Right. Right. Well, an interesting thing about when 9/11 came along, and I noticed you just had Giles Scott Smith here a little while ago talking about cultural diplomacy, and what we've looked at in terms of cultural diplomacy is by the 1990s, cultural diplomacy had basically disappeared because the Cold War was over. Suddenly 9/11 came along, and that reinvigorated that cultural aspect of U.S. foreign policy. But in terms of race, if you look at some of the initial responses, and I'm not talking just about the horrific racist violence that was inflicted on Muslim Americans and Indian Americans and all of these various groups in the United States in the wake of 9/11. But if you listen to the views of some of the U.S. policymakers, I mean, one of Bush's main policymakers said, look, we have one more attack like this, and nobody's going to be crying in their beer if we start throwing these people in concentration camps. And of course, immediately people's memories went back to World War II when hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were thrown into these concentration camps here in the United States. I was struck by how quickly that flared up. That people thought, well, after World War II and after the Civil Rights Movement and after all of these things had happened, those things would disappear. But it took, and not to downplay the immensity of 9/11, but it took that one event, and boy, those racist viewpoints, they snapped to attention right away, and they became extraordinarily useful. Not just for the politicians here at home, but in the American media. Suddenly, the evil Middle Easterner, the terrorist, the corrupt oil sheik, these kind of things just spouted out. And that's what I mean about racism. Is that prior to that time, had there been racist attitudes toward people of the Middle East? Certainly there had been. But it hadn't been a massive outpouring of that because it wasn't needed at that point. Now, in the wake of 9/11, they need that, that just exploded right away. If you look at China today, you don't have to look very far, unfortunately, in recent American history, to see how quickly. The economic challenge of China, the military challenge of China. What's one of the first things our U.S. government of a couple of years ago did? The China flu, the Kung flu. These dastardly Chinese who are trying to steal all, because let's face it, that's what those kind of people do. They steal people's ideas. Just as, once again, it reminded me so much of the views of Japan in the 1920s and 30s. The Japanese are good mimics. What they've done is they've stolen all of these Western ideas. That's how they become so powerful. So once again, I was struck, and not surprised, but I was struck by how quickly those racist tropes came into wide use. It wasn't as anybody shouted those down. They became a political rallying cry here in the United States. And you look at the horrific amounts of violence being conducted against Asian Americans right now. As I suggested, it's always there. It's always present. It's always there. It's always thriving. It's always moving. It's always changing. It's always adapting, and it's ready. It's ready for policymakers to use it, and they're very avid to use it. And once again, not because they think this will help whip up public support, not because they think it will serve this purpose or that. It's because they truly believe this. I mean, this is a foundational belief among many of these policymakers who put forth these views. They may try to tone down the horrible racist stereotypes they employ, although lately that has not seemed to be the case. But they believe this. They still believe that Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon attitudes are still significant. And you see that all over America today, with politicians using that rallying cry of an Anglo-Saxon American.
Yes, actually, when you mentioned the sort of the comment by the Bush administration officials, also sort of reminded of Bush himself referring to a crusade,
Yeah.
for example, and getting quite a lot of pushback for that at the time. Could I just ask you, just sort of turning a bit from diplomacy to war, as you did touch upon this a bit in your talk. I mean, I'm trying to sort of figure out how racism impacts not only about sort of how America goes to war, but who it goes to war against. I was, growing up, I remember sort of the comedian George Carlin sort of going on about, it's America's pastime to bomb brown people. And he would give examples, Vietnam, Korea, Libya, Panama, Grenada, Iraq. He says, essentially the only time that we ever fought white people was the Germans in the Second World War, and that was only because they were trying to cut in on our action about dominating the world. So of course we had to push back against that. But I mean, when I think about sort of like John Dower's work, for example, looking at U.S.-Japan, especially the issues about the atomic bomb, and then so on. I mean, I was just sort of curious about your views about how this has evolved, if it has evolved at all.
Yeah, well, it has certainly continued. I'm not sure it has evolved very much. I mean, if you look at the horrific racist tropes that were used to defend the American annihilation of Native Americans, that was used to declare war on Mexico and take 2/3 of that country away, that led us into Cuba to free them from Spanish control. If you look at this and you take it all the way up to Vietnam and more contemporary wars, those tropes come right back up. I mean, it wasn't any surprise that in Vietnam, what did the U.S. soldiers refer to that area outside their camp as? Well, that was Indian country. That was Indian country out there. When you look at how the Vietnam War was fought and the unbelievably massive amount of brutality that is inflicted upon these people, friend and foe. As one of the recent books about the Vietnam War put it, kill anything that moves. Well, that was the philosophy in many ways. These aren't accidents, though. And it's not as though it just flared up because we went to war. And when you go to war against people, of course, you have to engender hatred. You didn't have to engender hatred. It was already there. I think even when you look at World War II, with the atomic bomb, and of course the story always goes that we never would have used an atomic bomb against Germany, and I don't think we would have, because I think you would have had people going, well, yes, it's Nazis and it's Germans, but it's the land of Beethoven, it's the land of Goethe, it's the land of the culture, the land of this and that. Whereas with Japan, there was really very little hesitation about that. That these are people that had been portrayed during the entire war as vermin, cockroaches, mice, lice, fleas, and that's what you have to do. When you have an infestation, you eradicate. So yeah, I haven't seen a tremendous amount of what I'd call evolution toward a more enlightened viewpoint. And then when you look at some of the horrible actions that have taken place with U.S. military forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, elsewhere around the world in more recent years, what I've come to conclude is that these are not really anomalies. These are not things that, oh my goodness, it's an unfortunate thing, war brings out the worst in people. It's not bringing out the worst, it's just bringing out what's American. So.
Tom, I think for a final question, and that has to do with sort of your own observations about the field of U.S. diplomatic history and the extent to which that sort of evolved in terms of taking greater account of these issues. I mean, sort of, when did it really? I think it was in your book on the Cull of Empire when you talk about it, sort of becoming more of an issue, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, sort of like you say, in the last few years, taking greater sort of interest in this subject. But have you seen this continue, this interest continue and grow relative to other topics, or how do you see this going forward?
Yeah, I think U.S. diplomatic history has changed dramatically. You go back to 1980 with Charles Mayer's the classic chapter about marking time, in which he chided the field for not making any advancements, for doing the same old things again and again, going to Record Group 59 at the National Archives and going there through the State Department records and writing down what the Secretary of State said to the ambassador and the ambassador said back to the Secretary of State. Great white men doing great white things was basically what diplomatic history was doing. And I think the field from that time, even though there was some tremendous resistance to it, since that time, if you look at the Schaefer Conference, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, if you look at their conference booklet from 1980 and you compare it to what we're doing this year in 2021, it's night and day. And not just in terms of looking at race, not just in terms of looking at African Americans, looking at Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, women, looking at the impact of religion, looking at the impact of the environment, looking at the impact of science, of ideology, of culture. There were so many people that were just so aghast that our field would have been attacked back in the 1980s, but it really did provide an impetus to move the field literally into the present, and finally now here into the 21st century. And U.S. diplomatic history today doesn't look a whole lot like that old diplomatic history. And I think that's all for the good. Not that a lot of that old diplomatic history didn't set the basis for what we're doing today, but we had to move past that. And I think in terms of race, yeah, it started out in the 1990s as very clearly, well, we're going to look at African Americans' impact on race. We're going to look at American policymakers' racist attitudes toward other people. And that was a good starting point. And as I said, that's where I started out from. But we now need to move beyond that. We need to understand the issue of race in a much broader ideological context and a world context. As I noted, we've got to work more closely with these scholars all around the world who are also looking at these issues, and that's something that unfortunately diplomatic historians have not been known for over the years. But I think that's going to be one of the big changes you see.
Yes, I'm curious to sort of see how that progresses, assuming it does progress in the next couple of decades. Well, look, as it's now 7 p.m., I'm afraid I'll need to bring this session to a close. Professor Krenn, thank you so much for an absolutely superb presentation, which I found extremely useful and informative. Definitely a bit disturbing and provocative, but I think really highlighting how essential it is when trying to get a sort of a deeper appreciation of U.S. foreign policy to take much greater account of the issues of race and racism as being fundamental rather than mere appendages. So thank you very much indeed for that. Before leaving, I would just like to remind everyone that the seminar will resume in 2 weeks with Professor David Houghton, who will be speaking on political psychology and U.S. foreign policy. So I wish all of you a pleasant remainder of the day, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in a couple weeks. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.